Welcome to Friday. It means it's time for MSP Confidential, and we're here every Friday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming a new friend, Mr. Zach Kromkowski of Senteon, founder at Senteon. How are you, Zach? I hope you've been well.
Absolutely great. Glad I'm not the Friday episode in 2 weeks. That is the 13th. So glad we're staying away from that.
The Friday the 13th, you're right. I hadn't even thought of that. People still have a bit of a hang up over that. I remember watching those Halloween movies, Jason and Friday the
Oh
13th and
yeah.
all that stuff. Anyways, I guess it is October and it is close to that timeline when those things start to come back, those memories
Yep.
hit our wavelengths again. But Zach, dude, great to have you. Thank you so much for making a little bit of time to come hang out and talk about this. I threw around this idea of like, is security posture management a hot potato? And you find yourself now having started a company, built a company that is kind of dealing with security posture management. But I was curious to ask you a bit of like what got you here, because I know that in the MSP ecosystem specifically, founders always have these interesting stories of needing to solve for a very
Yep.
specific challenge and sort of doing the needful and starting a company to do it.
Yep. No, I super thankful to be here. I mean, you really kind of mentored a little bit to this of giving someone who isn't very well known and early in the space a founder, right? So thank you for, having me on the show. And when we came up with the title here, Hot Potato, it was very fun conversation because as you'll learn today, it's almost like this potato becomes a little bit of a grenade. Who's going to end up with it at the end? Who's going to be blamed for responsibility? It's like no one wants it, but we need to talk about it. So very excited for the topic today. And yeah, going back to Sention and why we did this, our professor back at Purdue, it was huge into CIS. It's the most important thing. The capstone project was actually hardening an Active Directory environment manually, right? Actually performing hardening on an AD, which there's any system admins, engineers out there, it's tough.
So was
There's
this a
no
systems engineering or systems admin specific major that you were doing at Purdue, or
So
what was the?
cybersecurity major,
Okay,
right?
okay,
Yep. And we have the non-traditional turned into security vendor for the MSP market when we actually weren't MSPs ourselves, right? This is actually our first company that we're running together. We're very fortunate to have a team of advisors and a COO who was an MSP, but this was new to us starting out. We didn't know the exact challenge we were solving for MSPs when we built the company. But what we did know is when we graduated school and went to the real corporate world, is that fundamental security configuration management wasn't really done. So we just started building this out of a like, why isn't this done type of mindset? Like, is it too difficult? Is there too much fear? Is it not required? And it started creating a lot of these questions because the things we were dealing with, my co-founder worked in a Cisco SOC, a lot of these false positives or just these alerts that were coming in could have been lessened if the configurations were just standardized. So it
yeah.
came out of just a necessity there that we were like, all right, let's build a thing and then see if the thing is a fit.
Yeah, interesting. And I think, traditionally MSPs have tried to do this through RMM and
Yep.
or a GPO and some of the stuff that is not necessarily, I guess, bulletproof in the sense that it's supposed to push out that managed state
Yep.
to the device. But nowadays, especially in remote scenarios where somebody may have authenticated once to Active Directory and gone off network for the remainder of their entire career, like GPO may not even, play a role in actually getting a desired state onto the machine anymore.
Yep. And
And so, like,
BYOD, we
yeah,
can't forget that either, right? Being on-prem is becoming more of a rarity.
yeah. And so I'm curious to ask you, like, what was the thinking behind making this your capstone project? Because I think it kind of has to be born from like identifying some kind of issue, or was just this kind of thing was just interesting to you in the moment.
So this was actually like the required project. So this wasn't self-picked. We don't hate ourselves that much. So this was a required thing to do as a group.
Gotcha. So we threw around this idea of like talking about Is security posture management a hot potato? And maybe it's worthwhile. I don't know, from your exploration of everything that was happening in the space prior to actually getting. Let me get you zoomed in here a tiny bit for the little
Good.
box of everything that had been happening in the industry. In terms of managing security posture management, because like there's such a wide spectrum of maturity with MSPs. There's this small folks, you know, 3, 4, 7 person shops that are
Yeah.
starting to think about security at this level, but maybe can't dedicate the resources or the time or the expertise to do it properly. And what the hell is properly to begin with? I think is worth talking about.
Oh,
And then there's like the really large shops who have started to do some really deep stuff, tying it to compliance, really trying to go a lot deeper, even in the conversation with clients and so on. So what is your take of the current state of security posture management? Sort of before we dive into some of the conversational stuff.
so security posture management, I guess to first define this, what goes into it, because you'll learn today, we're going to talk heavily into configurations and hardening, but security posture as a whole has a lot more to it, whether that's whitelisting, blacklisting, having an EDR, not having an EDR. There's a lot too that goes into security posture. And I believe the current state, from my point of view and everything I've learned about, is everyone really has a good EDR or an antivirus, and they have a lot of reactive security measures in preparation for when that bad thing does happen, or a lot of behavior technology for when that happens. So the security posture on the more reactive side, or even proactively reactive, if that's
Mm,
a way to
yeah.
say it, is pretty mature. I do believe there is a lot of technologies, and I believe most MSPs are managing this appropriately. We are still seeing, of course, shelfware. You buy it, you don't set it up right, it sits there. But security posture goes beyond just this proactiveness, preventative, left of boom. What can we do instead of accepting that an attack is going to happen, instead of accepting that we will be a target? What are people doing to prevent yourself from being a target? How can you change configurations? And how can you just prevent the entire thing from a bad actor getting a chance to exploit you, a chance for
Mm.
that EDR to react, right? And the security posture in that current state is very immature. And from our market research, we are very, very focused on MSPs, but even enterprise. This type of security posture management at the configuration of your assets. And when I say assets, I guess what is an asset? Matt Lee's favorite question. This conversation is really going to be focused more on the OS, the browser, but it also goes towards every application on that system, because every application is going to have ways to harden it, way to configure it, way to prevent risk, your Slack, your Zoom app, right? So the security posture in the current landscape today is very minimum on the preventative side from what I've seen.
Now, I mean, surely you're familiar with tools like Puppet and Chef and
Yep.
some of the other configuration state management stuff that I think very much crosses that fence over into security posture management at the device level. Why do you think
Mhm.
those tools didn't make their way to the MSP ecosystem, perhaps the way they should have? It's because they've been around for a long time, and
Yep.
it's been enough time for those things to mature and reach sort of this stable state. But what is your thought on that?
Yeah, no, and I do think that has been enough time. And to emphasize here as well, Senseon's not trying to really compete in that space, because those originally and still very much are created for those Linux systems. And why aren't they popular here is simply the complexity that goes into it. MSPs today are a lot of times, and you said this earlier, less than 5 people a shop. And those less than 5 people, there's going to at least be two business heads, maybe a couple engineers and accounting, right? None of these people are going to have the expertise to be a Ansible expert, a Chef expert,
Yeah.
right? So it just doesn't exist in this space. And ultimately, I mean, this is going to the greater business decision of those companies we mentioned. I don't believe they're designing their tool for the MSP market. And that's something we learned about constantly, is a ton of MSPs that want to do things the right way will not have a MSP focused solution to do so. They'll take an enterprise platform and make it work.
Mm.
Just find a way to make it multi-tenancy. So things are limited. Expertise isn't necessarily at the MSP level for specific solutions. So Senteon saw an opportunity and really is working to innovate this space.
This is interesting because I think if I think back to my early days of thinking about the tech stack before I started my MSP, there was definitely this like gravitational pull towards wanting to be in the enterprise tools because those were the better things to be.
Yeah.
Because you imagine you're gonna like grow to in unimaginable heights and you're gonna need the enterprise tools sooner or later, and there's this interesting sort of decision process that happens of like, well, do we want to like make the investment in the proper thing now? And so and you're right. I think a lot of these enterprise tools are not designed with some of the nuances that are necessary for MSPs, not the least of which is multi-tenancy. And so
Yeah.
when those things are missing, it just creates all these operational challenges for shops indeed. Well,
And
let me
I
throw
want to
up.
comment on one thing you said there, because investment ahead of time, I think this is critical. And honestly, this is just going to be speaking from the entrepreneurship side of myself and exposing some of the challenges that Sention had at the beginning. We made the commitment when designing Sention to be for the MSP market. And you said something very, very much that hit close to home was MSPs want to make an investment ahead of time, right? We're going to be enterprise focused. We're going to be needing those eventually. So let's do it while we're early. Those enterprise solutions, you are likely not their whale. They will likely not prioritize the features that you're looking for as an MSP. But us, when we were just starting out, a feature request from an MSP, I mean, that 10 endpoint, that 10-person shop, that's our whale. That's our whale starting out. So those feature requests to help guide an early stage company to design a platform to be enterprise grade, but designed for MSPs is totally possible. And there are early stage companies out there today that unfortunately don't can't weed through the pain to get to the point to where they can be an MSP platform. And this is just me advocating for every startup out there looking to position in MSPs. It's hard, but have those conversations and keep trying because there is a real opportunity to build MSP platforms.
Yeah, and honestly, I think the term enterprise grade is not necessarily accurate anymore,
Right.
or bank grade, or some of the many other things
I
that
like
we've
it.
traditionally associated with depth and maturity, and because we're looking for slightly nuanced solutions for the MSP market specifically. So this idea of the MSP evolution is the need to care. I this kind of when I first saw this image, I was like, "But we all care. We care so deeply." It got me thinking a few weeks ago about this idea. Like, do we care deeply? Yes, but about the wrong things potentially. And I had this whole conversation from a few weeks ago with Chris Jensen, who was on the live
Mhm.
stream, where we got into a bit of the standardization that MSPs have been kind of beat over the head to do over the last couple decades. And I think in many times in situations and new prospect conversations, it maybe plays a devil advocate's role in the sense that it kind of reduces the conversation to just this hardware infrastructure focus, perhaps. And the
Mhm.
MSPs are not necessarily spending the necessary time to go in to have a good understanding of what's happening at the client level, at their operational level, at the various sort of departmental things and motions and et cetera, et cetera. And so
Mhm.
this focus on standardizing, trying to make a client fit into their stack that they've chosen as the chosen thing, kind of commoditizes them automatically unless they're able to maintain sort of that high level conversation. And so I
Yep.
think this is you kind of suggested this idea that the owners of MSPs in particular, have to pay very close attention to what is the conversation you're having with clients to avoid your standardization being the culprit for commoditization,
Yep.
because otherwise we're just all in the race to the bottom. And so what is your thought here around this need to care? And it's tough, right? Because clients
Mhm.
don't necessarily, when it comes to security, like they immediately start to gloss over as soon as you start to throw around acronyms and terminology and things about security, especially when they don't feel that they're at risk, right? So, but your musings
Yeah.
and thoughts on this.
Yeah. I mean, the question for me that really kind of I guess, inspired this type of slide, which again, it was supposed to be a little bit of an edgy title because you shared this. Every MSP cares, but what are we caring about? So the question that I really posed to myself, kind of preparing for this, is like, what level of detail do MSP owners need to care about? And specifically, what level of detail within that security posture? In my intro, I mentioned the posture on the reactive, proactive side, that's there. There's so much care in getting an EDR in place, but that is the baseline. So when
Yeah.
I say
Table stakes.
baseline in this, that's the table stakes. When I say baseline here, that's almost if you don't do this minimum, you are not even a commodity. You're lower than a commodity, right? So I feel this conversation of standardization versus commoditization, and I'll try my best to relate this directly to security posture, is when you do that scan, we'll take Windows devices, for example. By default, only 70 settings on the OS will be compliant. That's by default. And when an MSP is working with their client, they have a great relationship, but that next MSP comes up and they can go, hey, let me scan your environment. Like, we won't tell your MSP, we won't talk about it to them. Let's just see what they're doing for you. They can show that configuration scan today and it will likely still be default. Why is it still default? It's very hard to do, and we'll get into the challenges here in a little bit. But because they have the opportunity to run a scan in literally 30 seconds and say, why isn't your MSP doing this? You're at risk of losing that deal, hurting the relationship, and not having an opportunity to overcome it, especially when that MSP is claiming they can do it. So, in summary, right, the standardization versus commoditization, right? If you can standardize all your configurations, if you can align to a framework and perform defensibility to say, hey, the scan they performed wasn't with our company standards. We're aligning you to this framework, right? Having defensibility into what you're doing and taking ownership and becoming that level of care that is needed to maintain and withstand that relationship through the storms. Because
Mm.
MSPs, I don't hear all the time, but I hear MSPs do take business from other MSPs. It happens, right? So you got to make sure you get to that commodity level, you do the baseline, but then you go to the next level.
Yeah, and defensibility is the pivot I think that we're making
Mhm.
as an industry in terms of like where we want to be. Resilience and defensibility. Just the
Yes.
making certain assumptions that the proverbial poop is going to hit the fan, and how do you recover? Because that's ultimately the big question as far as business continuity is concerned, and the thing that our client business owners really want to know, even if they don't want to hear it in that moment. But super interesting. And so the conversation around commoditization, and I'll bring it up again simply because
Mhm.
I think it is important to commoditize certain things. Like you said it is, if you're not even doing the EDR, if you're not even doing the posture management, you're lower than commoditized. You're not even deserving a seat at the conversation table at this point, potentially, and you're quickly competing only on price.
Yes.
And I think this is inherently also the risk for the industry and for small business customers, is that their lack of understanding may not allow them to make that informed choice of like, yeah, I realize that we need to be at least at this baseline, and but you're clearly not delivering that, so we're not going to go with you. Instead,
Yeah.
they actually is like all they look at is price, and they do go with the lower priced MSP that is not able to do some of these things. Like, what is the solution there? Is there a conversation? I think that we're not having, obviously.
Yep. I think it's how do we decide as MSPs, I mean us as MSP vendors, what is that minimum baseline and how do we get everyone to that par standpoint? Because let's look at the easiest ways an MSP can show that another MSP maybe isn't doing as much. I did a little survey. I would say about 90% of MSPs have a scanning tool of some sort. And that scanning tool, and I can call out some like, Cyrisma, Shield Cyber, Connect Secure. There's plenty of tools out there that can do scans, right? And how long do those scans take to run? Seconds. If we can eliminate the things that are easy to just point out as bad or that populate as red on reports, that needs to be the baseline because once the baseline is covered, you have an opportunity to truly differentiate. But at a minimum, everyone needs to make these reports to
Mm.
whatever extent possible green in a perfect world, but at minimum have defensibility as to why you're not doing certain things that may have to stay red.
Yeah, and I think there's a bigger conversation about this defensibility in the sense that for an MSP that has been traditionally technical, I guess, in the nature of their conversations, I think the obvious path to take in that prospect discussion is like, oh, well, they're not doing this and we're doing this. And it's sort of, apples to oranges when somebody's actually pulling ahead in terms of the maturity of the things they're doing, the scanning, the posture management, etc. But I think there's still this other layer of like, well, relating all those things to business outcomes, having the conversation with
Yep.
clients, understanding, the building blocks of all the ways that their business operates and how to be creative, I guess, about technology solutions. I think that's where the true differentiation happens because, it's just a matter of days, really, if you think about it, before the next MSP comes along and be like, yeah, we're doing that. Guess what? We're using the same tool and we figured out how to, show you a
Yes.
report for it. Like, ultimately, this is not, I think, the bread and potatoes of differentiation. It's going to come down to really that business level conversation. Um, but your thought on that and the struggle that MSPs have had traditionally in shifting away from the technical nature of the discussion.
Absolutely. And this is the hardest part. But like you said, I think it's one of the largest differentiators talking about those business outcomes. So even this morning, I had a meeting with DataStream. They're doing insurance brokering, right? And they're leaning towards more of the outcomes. It's not necessarily the technical policy. So for example, and I'll talk about Windows OS again, um, there's one setting that can disable RDP completely. If you disable RDP, it's a chances are you're not going to be able to perform some critical function as an MSP. But there's about 60 other settings that relate to RDP to make it more secure, but still allow it to be on, right? These could be
Mm.
user rights assignments, various encryption levels, right? And they can be disruptive if you're not ready to handle that level of security. But this allows you to go to that cyber insurance and that business conversation or justify it to your MSP saying, I'm sorry, to your client to say, hey, we're doing things in this respect because by allowing us to still RDP, we can do X, Y, and Z to keep your business up. But we're additionally doing, and this is the part of the conversation that's not always talked about. I know RDP is, in the news, people talk about Russian hackers taking over your
Yeah.
computer, keep it simple with them, right? But I know we're going to be RDPing, but we take all of these measures to make sure it can't be taken advantage of negatively. And that's one area where I said cyber insurance is trying to understand how do we need to mature as an industry, right? Insurance wants to mature. How do we mature and best recommend, give our premiums, right? How do we know things are actually the way they should? So all goes back to the value proposition and making your clients care about the communication of it. So the reason I think this is the hardest part when referring to security configurations is because without security configuration management, not doing anything, the platform still works. You can still go into that Windows computer. You can
Mm.
still go onto the browser. You can still sign into Slack. You can still sign into Zoom, right? Everything works, even if you don't do security configurations. So now the MSP has to go and say, hey, and this visual made me laugh. I know it's a meme, but ChatGPT just did it a little bit better. But technically, with all of these default settings set to the not secure state, your house is completely on fire, but you're sitting in there drinking your coffee because you can still drink your coffee. You're still able to drink your coffee. It's not like these default settings have now taken away the coffee or taken away the
Yeah.
house.
Yeah.
These default settings have caused fires around you that are just waiting for one bad actor to spread the fire to where now you're, the B word, breach, right? One bad thing, one bad actor taking advantage of a default config will remove the cup of coffee from your hand. But until that bad actor comes, It's okay your house is on fire. Is it?
On the topic of insurance, and I think this is quite timely too, because uh, the insurance companies have kind of just been navigating this by, thumb in the wind to some extent, for sure. But, the requirements continue increasing, the premiums continue increasing. But
Mhm.
I think the rotation that's happening is towards this idea of like, how can we verify continuous
Yeah.
management of some of these things. And I was preparing for a presentation I did last week in Miami, and one of the things I came across was, and people are familiar with the Verizon
Hmm.
security reports, and they have one specifically that is for the payment industry, the payment security report that they do. And one of the things that was interesting as I was talking about compliance and a bit of the ecosystem that exists there, because everybody knows about PCI for the
Yep.
most part, at least in our industry. Would it surprise you to know that fewer than 30% of people that satisfied a PCI compliance requirement are actually continuously compliant after the fact? And that's a staggering number to think about because there is no continuous management in that scenario. Like this,
Compliant that point in time, just like the scans. That point in time, this scan resulted in this.
yeah. And this is why I think, going back to Ansible and Puppet and Chef, this is why the continuous state management of a device being managed was so compelling, I guess. And this is, a super interesting place for MSPs to be because RMMs can only like push that one time change and
Yep.
check it maybe the next 5 minutes or the next time they check in. In Mac OS, it's very different, of course, because Mac OS has now the MDM framework that actually enforce this kind of setting. And but Windows is a little bit behind the eight ball here in the sense of like providing this continuous configuration state management. And so
Hmm.
I think the insurance piece is really interesting. And I think we joke about this all the time. Insurance has actually moved our industry forward more than any other
Yes.
initiative that's been around. But CIS seems to be taking a specific hold, and we see insurance providers, authorities kind of lean into a bit of CIS. And I know the
Yeah.
CIS is a kind of the chosen framework from your perspective, correct?
Yeah, so CIS is our chosen framework as Sention's point of view, and I can give a little bit of reasoning to why. But I also want to note with that conversation this morning, the one I provided as an example is also mapping to the MITRE framework. So
Yeah.
not just the preventative side, but they're also taking into account the attack techniques and seeing how can we, the single point, how do I make the whole MITRE attack map, covered, right? CrowdStrike does it. So many people do it. It's not real. But anyway, they're taking that into consideration. And that's a really cool thing. Going back to what you said about continuous, you did say specifically, RMMs can push change and whatnot. And unfortunately, whether people realize this or not, Intune, GPO, PowerShell, all of those are push only. Yes, you can push back on me to say, oh, I can make my PowerShell script check for monitoring and reporting. How many MSPs have a technical wizard enough to do a PowerShell script that checks for remediation, checks for monitoring on across 2000 settings? It'd probably take a lot of resources, extremely hard, not really feasible, let alone the ROI is not there.
Yeah.
But to my point, Microsoft is literally push only. So when you do a GPO scan or you do an Intune scan, that is displaying the value that it should be. Let's talk about attestation, cyber insurance. How do you prove that configuration is in the state that it says? Well, Intune says it should be. That's not actually reality. I mean, this is real experience to us, and hopefully Microsoft doesn't knock on my door after this, but we have proven through Senteon that Intune displays this value, but it was never successfully remediated at the local policy level. So now if you do that Intune scan report, that's false attestation, right? Maybe that is best that I could do and you don't get in trouble, but from the true security mindset, it was not true. So
Yeah.
that's kind of my point of view on the continuous. And I'm happy to talk towards CIS unless you want to expand on that one.
Yeah, I think it's worth maybe as we move forward here, we'll dig into CIS as needed. And thanks, Barry, for the comment. I think this is one of those realizations that the clients the conversation we have with clients about these things and how we're currently managed settings is the reason why perhaps they're not happening. I
Yep.
suppose is one of the, because there is maybe this embarrassing understanding that there's all these gaps in the way that we've been accustomed to doing management, and as we get savvier and savvier, and as the security vectors increase, we're all just more painfully aware of how inadequate the 20-year-old tool stack is at managing these things. So I get it. I totally get it. What was the next thing here? The money trail, security posture and the money trail. And this was, when you and I were talking ahead of the stream, I had this
Hmm.
idea, and I talked about this in this keynote from last week as well, that one of the interesting ways for an MSP to understand the building blocks of the clients that they're supporting, and where um, technology plays a creative role in solving unique actual challenges, and not trying to fit the round peg into the square hole of your technology stack necessarily, is to better understand how money flows inside of your clients' businesses. And sometimes just asking
Hmm.
this question, tell me a bit about, how a dollar moves within your organization. And it reminds me a bit, back in the day, I applied for a Mac engineering position at Google. I want to say
Cool.
13 years ago. And one of the interview questions I had live that the person asked me was, tell me what happens when you press return in an address bar after you've typed in an address. And this is a famously popular question. And some people will say, oh, well, it just returns a web page, and that's the outcome. But there's all these building blocks of like, okay, well, the address is looked up in the local host file. If it doesn't exist, then there's a DNS request, then that DNS request, and then like all the little pieces of how this stuff ends up producing a web page are those first principles, those building blocks. And these are the things that I think a lot of MSPs are painfully unaware of inside their clients' businesses, of how things work. And if anybody's watching and you go back to look at Chris Jensen's interview from a few weeks ago, he's a fractional CIO in enterprise, but he regularly works with MSPs, and he gives this account of a time when one of his clients was switching MSPs, and the MSP came in and, yeah, so here's our stack, and we're gonna put all these solutions in, and here's when we're gonna do them. And then the client calls, Chris afterwards, be like, these guys don't know the first thing about our business, yet they come and propose all these solutions, when they're gonna do it, and that we're gonna like it. And this is what I mean about the commoditization and the standardization maybe being a negative
Yes.
situation there. It just kind of lowers the opportunity to have this conversation at a true business outcome thing. And so understanding how money moves through operations is so critical. And I get just how ironic the difference of conversation is. Like, the client, you're not going to tell about the client about the 60 RDP settings that you're going to manage for them. This
No.
is not a point of differentiation, I guess, is kind of what I'm trying to get to.
Right. You're absolutely right. And I mean, this is a topic, I mean, do a whole session on commoditization versus standardization, because that entire stack, that MSP that's currently servicing them might be using the same stack to do maybe different things, right? But that commoditization is, there needs to be this minimum baseline to where someone does come to poach a client like that, and then they run their scans, right? They do all that, but they're already done. Once we take away and we all reach this baseline, it will be purely about, okay, now that everyone's commoditized, everyone's doing this minimum baseline, this minimum service, this minimum security. Now MSPs can really focus on, hey, everyone's got the same thing now. I need to learn about the business. I need to do the next step, right? And this is, to your point. I mean, I'd love to even ask the audience, right? How many MSPs out there have just straight asked the question, Mr. End Client, how do you make your money? When a customer enters your shop or when you get a PO, what happens? What does that
Yeah,
process look
all
like?
the various
Right?
steps. Yeah.
And all those various steps, a lot of times they'll be taken from a computer that has an OS, that has applications on it. What applications are they using? And this allows the MSP to say, hey, none of those applications are traditionally in my security stack. Let me look into it, see how the configurations are and how they're set up. And now you're performing a personalized value added service to understand their unique application, their unique money trail, right? And securing it better without breaking anything.
Oh,
Talk
music,
about
music to my
losing that
ears.
business. You can't lose that business, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
so meaningful.
Well, that's exactly where you like the client wouldn't even consider it. It's like this person brings value to our business, and it's the difference between being a cost center and like providing true ROI. But you mentioned Matt Lee, and Matt talks about this
Yeah.
interesting thing because I think there has been traditionally this idea of like how do we show value to clients? How do we show that IT has ROI? But we're stuck in this like standardization commoditization sort of level, and it's interesting because I think security introduces a whole other bandwagon of challenges, and one is that if you consider what percentage of businesses are going to have a security incident, I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that it's going to happen to you, if not this year or perhaps next year. And that comes with an immediate loss of revenue of whatever the average money is, $7 million or a couple $100,000 if your accounting person gets phished to change banking details on a payment. And so we're no longer trying to create a positive ROI. We're just trying to not lose money. And it's a very different type of approach to the conversation altogether, isn't it?
Could you say security is a profit protector, right?
Well, yeah, I guess you can skin it many different ways, but the average small business client be like, well, I don't, what's the ROI on that spend? Like, how is buying a new switch going to help us make more money in our business? And the answer is that it's not. And this is the challenge of coming in too strong on the standardization without the client buy-in. Like in that example that Chris was giving on the live stream, and like if the MSP had just ironically, and it's almost funny that they may have done the same exact things 3 months later, but there's an opportunity to have a
Yeah.
slightly different conversation and to elevate that to the point where the client understands and sees the justification and the value of the things being attached to those business outcomes, without it being just this, strong push from the MSP's perspective to achieve their stack standardization because it's good for them. Like it's not necessarily good for the client in that context. You got to get the buy-in. But this is the same thing across so many levels of those conversations too.
Mhm.
How do you? I you haven't been in market very long, but
Sure.
I'm hoping you've had enough conversations with your customers, with your partners, that you're starting to see some of the ways that they are succeeding at presenting the value conversation to their clients. Have you
Yeah.
found so far it's a little bit of the technical spin on it, or are you seeing some people really connected to the compliance, the business outcomes, creating a program for managing this continuously at their client businesses? Tell me a bit of your experience so far.
Yeah. Now that we've had a lot of conversations down this vein, and shout out to Keith Nelson and Sean Lardo. They're very much advocates for talking about these business outcomes of security configuration management. And honestly, Lewis, it's very hard to educate an MSP who's never prioritized this or never gone through it on how they can present it to someone who knows even less than them, right? It's not easy. So really, realistically, I've learned three things happen when security configuration management starts, or you look at Senteon or you do it manually, right? There's three real outcomes. One is you realize this is something that needs to get done and the end client will never understand or appreciate it, right? We have those end clients and they just eat the cost and then raise their price point at the next renewal, right? Hey, this needs to get done because it's an ROI to my MSP to have all of my clients standardized, right? So there's ROI there by doing this for the MSP, and they'll choose to do it that way. The other way is relating configuration management to a different topic. So what do I mean by that? If we look at the CIS benchmarks, which relate to the CIS controls, they kind of feed into it so that you can achieve CIS compliance, which again, we can get into that later. But they'll relate hardening and security configurations to something they do care about and do understand. I think we said phishing earlier, right? The accountant clicks a fish, right? When they click that fish, it's already executed a lot of the time, right? It's already done, it's over. Now everything's in trouble. instead of presenting hardening, I've advised and work with my partners to say, hey, let's present a story about a fish. Let's say, hey, when this fish is clicked, here's the next thing that happens after the fish, right?
Mm,
We can't guarantee all of your employees. I can't guarantee that fish won't even make it, right? I can't guarantee that without doubt. And then that MSP can't guarantee, I can't guarantee when it makes it, your employee won't click on it. So let's talk about worst case scenario, what happens after they click on it. And this is where they do lean a little technical to say, hey, it has to be executed. So you have to um, tell it where to be executed or tell it where to download. We can add an additional click layer before, so it gives the employee a chance to think about it, right? So there's a lot of settings that relate to insider threats, that relate to phishing, that relate to these topics that they do
interesting.
know about and they are afraid, well, afraid of, right? We don't want to use scare tactics, but at the end of the day, it's a little bit of what we're doing. And then the third way that I've worked with my partners to present this to the end client level is to actually deploy Senteon out there. This is, I guess, a little bit of a plug. Sorry about this, but like this is the third way.
I actually have
You
a sound
deploy
for that. The little bicycle horn is the pitch slap alert.
the
But go
pitch
ahead.
slap. So you could deploy it out because we do map these settings to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So now we allow our partners to say, hey, in your current combination of settings, you're at risk of this piece of the MITRE ATT&CK chain. So we're now mapping settings to real attack pieces so that they can better relate it and see a picture.
I think what was interesting about this Verizon, and I'll go back to this idea of continuity and continuous management of this, is maybe the baggage that we have of MSPs of
Mhm.
thinking of everything like a project with a finite start and a finite end. And this is very much the MO of working with a new client, a new prospect comes in, is like, oh, we're going to do all these things. Here's all this remediation stuff we do. And it's like projects, projects, projects. In fact, a lot of the whole QBR agenda that MSPs have
Yeah.
is discovering more projects. And they all have like a beginning and an end. And I think there is so much of a lift in changing the way we work around, finite project to
Mhm.
ongoing program.
Yeah.
And I'll see if I can find it in a minute, and I'll throw it up on a slide. Verizon had this really interesting what not to do in program management that will certainly, lead to failure of this initiative. And many of the things were very early conversations, the buy-in, the understanding of the effort required, and so on and so on. But continue chatting. Let me bring up the next slide here.
Yeah.
The real opportunities, because we were talking about like getting into this deeper conversation, understanding those building blocks of the business. And I think the same is true internally at the MSP, because we are I guess, victims of the same challenge of the standardization commoditizing us, is that we end up doing the same things internally as well. We stop innovating, we stop finding ways to get better at certain things.
Yeah.
But talk to me about your discoveries
Yeah.
of this.
So it's funny you mentioned QBRs, because this is a perfect segue of, this slide where we're uncovering the real opportunity. So the theme, if you haven't put this together yet, is standardization versus commoditization. In my view, and the trends that I'm honestly seeing, every MSP needs to do what's above the water. That above
Hmm.
the water is the scanning, the remediation of scans. It's all the things that really you could go to any end client and say, hey, here's my security stack. This is a fit for everyone. There are those things like every client should probably disable SMB1, right? They're likely healthcare, old. I understand there's exceptions, document them. But there is effectively something you can do across the board, and that's the commodity level where the real opportunity comes from. And I mean, I think we agree here as well, together, Lewis. Those QBRs shouldn't be used to necessarily discover new projects, new revenue streams, right? It should be talk about what's been going on, how we're going to continuously keep doing the same things, continuously improving, as opposed to saying, hey, here's the next thing we uncovered during this call. Here's our Q4 objective, right? There is no quarterly outcome per se. It's just continuous improvement because there
Hmm.
is always more. So by leveraging the top of this iceberg, the visual, everyone's seen the iceberg visual. After that, Follow the money trail. Where's the opportunity? What's unique about them that you can learn about and improve in a personalized way that provides ongoing, well, using the word of the day, provides continuous value as opposed to just project value.
Yeah, absolutely important. Let me see if I can get this
Yeah.
this idea of this program management stuff here up on a slide, because I think it is super interesting just how that really brings it into view. The challenge being, this very, very strong gravitational pull that we have towards projects and
Yep.
start and stop. And it ends here. And that this is, just the nature of the beast, I guess. And so it just
Yep.
takes such a big fundamental change in how we think about going to market, how we think about this client relationship stuff. All
And
right, I think I
let me
almost have it ready
elaborate
here.
on project too while you pull this up, right? The other picture there is like avoid the knee jerk. So when we talk about CIS and CIS benchmarks specifically, there's 500 different recommendations on a workstation, 450 on a server, another 100 some on a browser. If you look at that as a project and you just kick them all on, that is going to be very painful. The project's over, you can get paid, but it's not a good experience. It's not the communication probably wasn't there. If you're changing 1,000 some settings in a week, you
Yeah.
probably didn't communicate things. So this again, leaning back into what you're saying with continuous, it's saying, hey, here's the ultimate goal, right? But the goal doesn't end once we achieve it. That doesn't stop the goal. That doesn't stop the project. Here's the continuous aspect of that goal so that you can continuously have that conversation. There you go.
Yeah, so this was the stuff that I was talking about of like how to avoid a program that requires this continuous view and this continuous management. How to avoid the failure of it? And there's some really interesting things here. And this payment security report, you just Google it, Verizon 2023 payment security report. And it has some really interesting stats on like this failure to maintain compliance after the initial assessment. Um, but these are things that business owners, I think, should be aware of in terms of standing up any kind of initiative around compliance or security programs or things that manage the posture of their business and improve their ability to be resilient and recover from an
Yeah.
incident. Because again, these are the conversations we're not having today. We're just coming in and saying, yeah, the typical we'll take care of it approach that MSPs have and the business owners are just accustomed to delegating. Like this is what happens today, even with security questionnaires. It's like, oh, so a customer sent us this thing. Can you fill it out for us? They're not even involved at the understanding level of what do these things mean for their business. And so I found these to be super interesting just as a,
This
as
is,
a,
I haven't seen this slide before. I mean, I'll download this myself, but I mean, let's look at that third bullet point to in relevance to the conversation we're having. It is not just a simple project. The project is part of a greater program, right? It's the bigger picture because without that bigger program talk, without sharing, yes, we're not saying you can't do projects. You're going to do projects, but a series of projects build a program. And that program may not have an end. It will have outcomes along the way, but it may never end. So presenting this, I mean, even in a visual way, hey, Mr. Client, from working together, here's what we've done, and I've learned this is how you make your money. I've created a program where I've outlined your applications here. I've outlined the objectives I have of how we're going to make this process so that it never goes down. Because you know as well as I do, Mr. Customer, when it goes down, you can't make money. And my
yeah,
job as your service provider is to make sure you can always make money. Reframing that conversation to say you care, relate to them. You want them to make money. You don't want to
yeah.
just have them pay their bills, which they always do on time every time, right, everyone? But you want them to want to pay on time.
Totally, totally, and it takes just again elevating a bit of that discussion to 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 not be focused on the hardware lifecycle because this is
Yep.
just the strong magnet that exists in our conversations today. So like let's go back to this idea of the knee jerk and I think communicating in terms of business value in terms of business terms is harder than we think, and what
Yeah.
we think is valuable to the business is often
Yes.
such a departure from the things, and a lot of that misunderstanding comes from just not having spent the time understanding how that money flows, how that dollar moves from department A to B to C and so on. So I think this is super important. One of the other tips that I had that came out from one of the MSP Confidentials a while back, Joe Markert of Transformative out in California, he gave this idea of something he had started to do that was getting some good traction, which is we have been used to pulling clients into our cadence of QBR
Mm-hmm.
meetings, and it turns out it's not that easy because the MO is kind of telegraphed pretty early. It's like, yeah, what is the next thing you want me to spend money on is kind of the MO of these QBR meetings. Instead, he got his clients to start bringing him into their EOS meetings or their cadence or their strategic meetings, once or twice a year. Obviously, exposing him to a bigger number of folks on the executive team, a deeper opportunity to understand some of the challenges cross functionally that they're experiencing, where technology may actually play an interesting role. And I thought that was a super neat idea that people should consider trying to bring in. And again, don't let standardization be the enemy here, because I think the challenge is like, yeah, that's a great idea. And then you go and you tell all your VCIOs to start doing that with all their clients. And it doesn't work like that. You gotta have to test it, iterate, document the process, figure out what are the levers that are going to make it work for your organization, and do it with one or two clients. Find out what are you going to actually do once you get there as well, because you gotta let it play out and then come back and start to expand that standardization into your other clients. But this is the whole point,
I,
that standardization can be a negative too.
Yeah, I love the idea of not forcing your cadence upon them. So, I did an interview with Felicia King specifically, but I've heard a lot of people really share this story. You don't want to force yourself onto them. You want to become part of that team. Her verbiage is you need to have a seat at the table. If you don't have a seat at the table, your word will never be taken for serious, right? There may be, if it's a larger enterprise, there may be middle management who never is communicated it appropriately. So you need to have that seat at the table to have things get done. What if you can't have that seat at the table? I mean, that's
You're
hard.
doomed.
That is
You're
your,
doomed, and I'll tell you why. Because as
yeah,
as I have conversations every week with MSPs, there's a desire to get a little more mature, go a little bit more up
yeah,
market. But guess what? The more up market you go, the bigger the discrepancy there is between the size of your MSP and the size of the clients you're supporting. And whether we want to understand it or believe it or not, the clients that are 150, 200 people, 300 people will discount your views immediately just for being a 20-person business. It's like, what does a 20-person business have that can offer me in terms of advice? And this is why it's even more important at that sort of discrepancy as your clients get bigger or larger away from the size of your own MSP. To better understand how the stuff works inside their business, like even
yeah.
more important. It's maybe not a challenge when your customers are the same size you are, but that's almost never the case, right?
Right. That mutual respect is kind of earned just because you're in the same position, you're going through the same challenges. But that larger enterprise, like, well, we're way more mature than you already. What are you going to teach me? And it's like
Yeah,
reminding them, hey, you called me to be here. You chose me as your partner. Here's what I need to be treated and get things done. And that could be a seat at the table, right? And if you do earn that, if you are in a position where you feel you have that seat at the table, the other big piece from this interview I did was determining who owns what. This piece right here creates accountability because without accountability of each piece of software or each process, right? Who's ever going to have to defend the way things are? Who's ever going to want
yeah,
to improve the way things are if no one owns anything? And when I say figure out who owns what, I don't mean for your own documentation. I literally mean you can document this as a team with your client. Say, okay, if I'm understanding this whole picture together, Jenny's responsible for this process, but Mark's responsible for the program within this process, right? So learning and mapping out again how they make money or who owns what. Every app there's ROI to almost everything in business, right? You don't buy something if it doesn't do something for that process. But who owns what? Because this is how you can make things better and a stronger fit. Because without that, you're just presenting commodities.
yeah. And I think when you start to put it in the context of continuity early, and I love this little bomb icon here with the word complacency on it. It's
I like
literally
that
the
one too.
it's literally our as MSPs, it's the biggest enemy. And everybody starts with the best intentions and this great attitude, and everybody's like gung ho. It's like, But the reality is that clients expect, to bring on a new MSP for everything to change for the better without actually making any real change in the business somehow. And so that's, a little mad if you think about it. But this is why I think the compliance piece plays a central role of like
Yeah.
getting the client subscribed to this idea of compliance and aligning with the framework is the thing that will keep you moving continuously through the cycles. Because if you just sort of put it out, it's like, oh, we're going to align you to all these controls, you might still do it the one time and kind of let it, uh, fade into the shadows, because like this is, you get busy with the project mindset. It's like, oh, we got to make some money, and here's a new client's coming and they have a big remediation project, and everybody shifts to the thing over there. So
Hmm.
continuous program management is such a key piece of this whole
And
conversation.
following this framework, we talk CIS, Senteon chose CIS, but this is a pre-made roadmap. This isn't something that you have to tell your client, hey, I came up to this. This is unique to you. It's my opinion. This is, hey, this globally
Yeah.
recognized nonprofit created this template roadmap that outlines X, Y, and Z. I've now taken their globally recognized best practice roadmap and related it to all of your business processes. I've related this best practice roadmap to how you make money. And here's the program, right? Not the project. Here's the program that I'm going to set us on to achieve security and maintain or protect profits, like I said earlier, right?
Yeah. Evangelism here is so key, and I think
Yeah.
that's going to be the shifting tide in us differentiating will be truly whether we can have those conversations, get the clients thinking about this stuff internally, doing the lift of standing up the program and the security committee and all the little bits and pieces to drive these compliance programs forward. Man, what
Yeah.
a interesting, challenging thing, and time to be going through right now, is if you're an MSP, right?
It's fun. I mean, you guys are creating the path, right? I mean, and I think you agree with me, Lewis. There's a real evolution, and there are going to be MSPs who are left behind. The MSPs who never picked up a framework. It's business. It is cutthroat. And I do truly believe the MSPs who take this stuff seriously today, one, if your strategy is an exit, you're going to get acquired by a larger MSP because you're doing things the right way. But two, you're going to stay alive. You're not going to be left behind because you started this ahead of time. And one final shout out for CIS. If CIS means absolutely nothing to you, I got to emphasize here as well, CIS crosswalks to the things you probably care about, whether that's NIST,
Yeah.
PCI, SOC 2, FFIE CCAT, right? CMMC, that's a hot one for us. But it will present crosswalk recommendations through their controls that you can then present to the end client because the end client doesn't know CIS, and you may not have known CIS going into this call,
Yeah.
but you will know the things they fit into.
Yeah. Dude, such a great conversation. Thank you for letting me bend your ear on some of these ideas.
It's
And
fun.
I hope people are thinking more about this continuous posture management. I think it's going to be the next echelon that MSPs have to get to truly differentiate, and linking it, coordinating it to the true business conversation with their clients, and all that piece that needs to happen so early in the relationship cycle, right? So, thank you again for being here, spending a little bit of your Friday
Absolutely.
afternoon hanging out. I hope to see you at one of the upcoming events, perhaps, if you're doing some of those.
It will be. Can IT is next for us. And then I'm actually presenting at CornCon on a topic very similar to this.
Right on. Well, I'm sure you'll enjoy the Canadian desert that is the Kelowna wine country,
Yep.
and it's supposed to be really nice next week here in this area. So, dude, thank you again for everybody else tuning in today. Thank you for catching this episode. We're here every Friday at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. You can find a history of all the episodes on the ScalePad YouTube channel, or just visit mspconfidential.com and that'll take you there. Please like and subscribe. I think we'd love to grow a bit of the viewership of this channel, and there's a ton of really great conversations we're having with people like Zach. And so thanks for joining us today. And until the next time, we'll see everybody soon. Ciao.